This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on India's stand on counter-terrorism and fixing responsibility on terror funding at SCO Defence Ministers meeting. The participants are Dilip Sinha, former diplomat, and S. Rangabhashyam, AIR correspondent.
Hello and welcome to this program on India's stand on counter-terrorism and fixing responsibility on terror funding at the SCO Defence Ministers Conference. And to discuss this issue, we have with us Mr. Dilip Sinha, who is a former ambassador. Mr. Sinha, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Mr. Sinha, our Defence Minister, Shri Rajnath Singh Ji, has called upon the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member countries to collectively work towards eliminating terrorism and fix responsibility on those who aid or fund such activities. To begin with, tell us how easy or difficult it would be for this group to, fix responsibility of terrorism and also aiding and funding terror activities.
Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as you must be aware, has become a reasonably important regional organization, not so much because of its achievements, but because of its size. It is 40% of the world's population and 30% of its GDP. As you know, it started a long time back. It was started by China and Russia. And in the initial years, the focus was on military cooperation to reduce tensions on the border in Central Asia and then to reduce forces. Later, when the organization was expanded with the inclusion of Uzbekistan and China's interest in curtailing terrorism in Xinjiang increased, then the organization moved its focus more towards terrorism. And one of the permanent bodies of the SCO, called the Regional Anti-Terror Structure, was set up with its headquarters in Tashkent. Now, China's focus on terrorism in this organization is on Xinjiang to ensure that the Uyghurs who are fighting for their independence in that region do not find shelter in the neighboring countries in Central Asia or even in Afghanistan and Pakistan. For India, the focus on terrorism is on the cross-border terrorism that we get from Pakistan, primarily in J&K, but also in other parts of India. And now, the SCO has this important structure that I mentioned, RATS, rather ironically called RATS, in which there is an effort made to increase cooperation against both terrorism and funding. And lots of meetings are held. In fact, there are also military exercises, joint exercises by the member states on anti-terror activities. And in fact, some time back, even India and Pakistan had participated in this anti-terror exercise. But in terms of the cooperation that actually exists among the members of the organization, there really is precious little to talk about here. And one of the problems that we face is that the country that we are most concerned about on terrorism is Pakistan, which itself is a member of this organization. Now, ironically, Pakistan did not participate in the meeting of the defense ministers, which our Raksha Mantri chaired yesterday, but it participated virtually from Islamabad, and that too not the defense minister, but the advisor on defense to the prime minister, which shows how serious Pakistan is and how sensitive Pakistan is not to be seen or to be participating in a meeting chaired by India. We'll have to see what happens when the foreign minister, whether he comes or not, because he's also been invited. So here we have a situation where the organization, while it can certainly take some measures to increase cooperation among member states on terrorism, I'm not sure what it can do on preventing funding of terrorism, because of the fact that it doesn't have any mechanism to impose sanctions, for example, the way Financial Action Task Force, for example, has when it grey-listed Pakistan for 4 years. So the cooperation would have to largely come from voluntary action by member states. And here one can only hope that as member of SCO, Pakistan will start taking some action. That's a fond hope. And China will also show greater cooperation in dealing, especially on the hold that it puts in the Security Council on listing terrorists based in Pakistan as global terrorists.
Yeah. Ambassador Sinha, we all, do acknowledge the fact that cutting off funding could actually, stifle terrorism and actually, lead us towards eliminating terrorism in a big way. But in order to, cut off the funding, you need to identify. But globally, there is this anonymity in financial networks, which makes it very tough, really challenging to identify the countries or economies which are directly or indirectly funding terrorism?
Well, actually, one of the problems that the world faced on terrorism was that before 9/11, even Western countries were often soft on such organizations. As you know, when the Afghan war took place, a lot of these terror organizations were set up in Pakistan and they carried out the jihadi attacks. So that was the time when there was a lot of money flowing into the coffers of the terrorist organizations. But after 9/11, Financial Action Task Force was set up precisely for the reason that you mentioned, because of the free flow and the easy flow of capital across borders. It is very difficult to keep track of money flowing into terrorist organizations. Now here, the FATF started taking action and started putting in place various mechanisms to follow money trails. And there was a considerable degree of success in this because the Western countries were genuinely very serious. And when India joined the FATF, India also got into this exercise of ensuring that money did not flow into any terrorist organization, either through Indian channels or into India. And the mechanisms that were available, the sophisticated information technology mechanisms, could be used to track money trails. And one must say that to a great extent, this kind of funding of terrorism has slowed down. But there is still money flowing, especially from countries like Pakistan, which actually harbors terrorists and therefore is not serious about taking action. Remember when Pakistan was put on hold in the FATF 4-5 years ago, Pakistan initially tried to hoodwink the FATF by claiming that it had taken action. But the FATF kept monitoring Pakistan's progress, and because when Pakistan's economy started collapsing, FATF eased its controls and let Pakistan off the grey list last year. But nevertheless, Pakistan is still under pressure that if it does not show action or if there is blatant flow of funding into terrorist organizations, then the FATF may come back and the controls that were the monitoring, it's called the increased monitoring of the country that had been put in place earlier, will come back to Pakistan. So yes, monitoring financial flows is extremely difficult, but nonetheless, we have to develop tools and trying to stay one step ahead of the terrorists. And in this, international cooperation is taking place to a certain extent, and we should try and strengthen that cooperation.
Ambassador Sinha, don't you think with the advent of new age technology, things like cryptocurrencies or virtual assets and wallets, it's all the more easy for these anti-national and terrorist organizations to use all these new age financial technologies to their benefit and channelize the financing and funding?
Absolutely. You remember before 9/11 and the airport security, which used to be lax, a lot of the movement of money across borders took place in cash. Now that has stopped. So if money flows through banking channels, then organizations like the FATF are able to keep track and at least check some of the funding. But with cryptocurrency, which by definition is a secret currency which we can keep track of, it becomes extremely difficult for even the most sophisticated IT experts to keep track of the flow of this kind of money, which is why many countries are skeptical. Some countries have banned cryptocurrencies, and most countries certainly frown upon cryptocurrencies, and they're taking action against it, which is why it has not picked up the way some of the founders had hoped it would. And one hopes that the governments will be able to stay ahead of these both private companies and terror organizations that seek to move money across borders or store their wealth in currencies that cannot be kept track of by governments.
Mr. Sinha, our Defence Minister also expressed concern over the radicalization of youth in many countries, terming it a major security challenge and an obstacle in the path of socio-economic progress of any country or any society. We know that, in our neighborhood, radicalization is continuously happening. So if there are X number of people, subscribing to a certain ideology or a terrorist organization, they are being eliminated by the defense forces, by the security forces. But newer people are joining it because of radicalization, which is actually a root cause. So don't you think the organization SCO, including all the member countries, should target at the root and stop radicalization at the very beginning itself?
Well, yes, one hopes that organizations where governments meet, for example, this SCO, will at least highlight the problem and alert governments to this. But then governments are aware in countries like Pakistan, where there is state-sponsored radicalization of the population, especially of the youth, which become very fertile ground for terrorist organizations to recruit their foot soldiers. And this is the root cause of continuance of terrorism and the ability of terrorist organizations to keep getting new recruits to commit acts of terrorism on their behalf. Now, in the SCO, our defense minister has highlighted this issue. One hopes that other governments will listen to this advice, because as Pakistan has realized, radicalization radicalizes not only some organizations but the whole society. And then Pakistan itself claims that it is a victim of terrorism. But this terrorism is the terrorism that it has foisted on itself. And that is what happens when a society tries to foment or promote radicalism.
Mr. Sinha, last year in November, there was a conference called the third No Money for Terror conference, which was held in New Delhi. And the Union Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, observed that we need to, kind of trace, target and terminate in order to, emphatically take on terrorism by the horn. Don't you think this kind of a strategy needs to be adopted by the SCO also, so that, there is a kind of a multi-pronged strategy to have counter-terrorism mechanism?
Well, on the face of it, there is commitment among all members of the SCO to take action against terrorism. And that can be seen in the outcome of the defense ministers' meeting that took place yesterday. All members subscribed to the protocol that came out of the meeting. But the real test lies in what the countries do after the protocol has been adopted. And here I'm afraid at least Pakistan's record is extremely weak. So we just have to continue pressing countries in organizations like the SCO to impress upon them and to bring collective pressure upon countries to take action. This is not going to be an easy task, especially in the SCO, but nonetheless India is a member, and India and certainly Russia, with whom we have very good and close relations, can keep continuing to put pressure in the organization on countries to move in the direction in which we will have zero funding for terrorism, and radicalization of the youth can also be checked.
Mr. Sinha, don't you think the SCO doesn't have any power to impose, sanctions on the member countries? So that in itself could be a major deterrent and a handicap to, actually implement what all is decided upon and deliberated.
Yes, that is a problem that all international organizations face, except the Security Council, which is the only international organization which has the power to impose sanctions or even to authorize military action. But as we know, the Security Council can only act when the permanent five agree, and because each of the permanent five has a veto. And China and Russia are both permanent members, as are the three Western countries. So unless all five agree, the Security Council cannot take any action. As far as the other organizations are concerned, they can only act as organizations to encourage member states to take action. Now, the FATF is a Western organization where the Western countries, they sit down and agree upon certain action to be taken. As I said, since 9/11, their cooperation has increased and they have become a lot more serious about controlling terrorism. And therefore, they do take some action. For example, in the case of when Pakistan was put in the grey list, then Pakistan's access to international funding became so much more difficult. And that was one of the important reasons for Pakistan's economic crisis. So it took place slowly, but the impact was there. So countries which are major economic powers, they can impose sanctions either alone or multilaterally through their allies and bring about a certain change in the actions of the country that is affected by it.
Ambassador Sinha, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on India's stand on counter-terrorism and fixing responsibility on terror funding at SCO Defence Ministers meeting. The participants were Dileep Sinha, former diplomat, and S. Rangabhashyam, AIR correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsttalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 92890 94044.